Welcome to our panel as part of webinar series co-organized by the International Press Institute and Columbia Global Centers, Istanbul. My name is Işın İlicin. I'm a journalist from Turkey and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, just a few notes on the flow of our session today. Our panel will last approximately 1 hour. First, I'll ask questions to our panelists, one for each in 2 rounds. And then we would like to open up our panel to your questions. So please feel free to use Q&A function to submit your questions. And our esteemed guests will try to answer as many as they can. For all journalists, especially for those of us who are covering controversial topics or living under autocratic governments where freedom of expression and of media is severely restricted, harassment, online or offline, is a constant challenge. With the proliferation of social media and due to the polarized climate of our times, journalists are regular targets of online attacks. But female journalists face a double burden, being attacked as journalists and as women. That is, when women are the target, online harassment quickly descends into sexualized hate and threats. According to a study by UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists, nearly 3/4 of women journalists say that they have experienced online abuse, harassment, threats, and attacks. And most alarmingly, 1 in 5 who participated in that survey reported that they experienced physical attack stemming from the initial online harassment. And the perpetrators range from misogynistic mobs seeking to silence women to state-linked disinformation networks aiming to undercut press freedom and chill critical journalism via orchestrated attacks. Here, to help us understand and to counter this phenomenon, are 3 well-qualified panelists. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them before I invite them to comment. Professor Anya Schriffin is the director of the Technology and Media Specialization at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and a lecturer who teaches on global media, innovation, and human rights. She writes on journalism and development, investigative reporting in the Global South, and has published extensively over the last decade on the media in Africa. More recently, she has become focused on solutions to the problem of online disinformation, earning her PhD on the topic from the University of Navarra. Welcome. Arzu Geybulla is a colleague and Azerbaijani columnist and writer with a special focus on digital authoritarianism and its implications on human rights and press freedom in Azerbaijan. Throughout her journalism, Arzu wrote for Al Jazeera, Eurasianet, Foreign Policy Democracy, Democracy Lab, Coda, Open Democracy, and Radio Free Europe with Baylan on CNN International. In 2014, Arzu Geybulla was featured on BBC 100 Women Changemakers. And since 2019, she managed the Azerbaijan Internet Watch, a platform that documents and monitors information controls in Azerbaijan. Welcome, Arzu, as well. And Javier Luque Martínez coordinates advocacy and communication on IPI's digital platforms. He holds a master's degree in international journalism, and he also has a bachelor's degree in journalism and psychology. Prior to joining IPI, he worked as a foreign correspondent in Los Angeles, covering the National Basketball Association for several online publications and over 40 TV channels. He also previously worked as a crime reporter for the main nationwide radio station in Spain. Welcome as well. Thank you all for being with us. And I'd like to start with you, Arzu. Since 2014, I know that you have been the target of an extensive online abuse campaigns, many, including dozens of death and rape threats. Most recently, an interview that you gave about Azerbaijan's ceasefire with Armenia in 2020 triggered again a vicious campaign in which your family was also targeted. So could you tell us a little bit about your experiences, the emotional and the physical impact, and how you deal with these attacks? What makes you keep doing what you are doing and be such a courageous person?
Thank you so much for having me here today and the question. There are different forms of different ways that you get affected by this experience of online harassment and abuse. There's the emotional side of things, the mental side of things, and there's the professional side of things, right? So if I take a step back and go back to 2014, when I had my first experience with online harassment, when I didn't even know that what I was experiencing was online harassment, a form of online abuse. The way I responded then is very different to how I respond now when I get similar threats or similar comments. But the emotional toll, the sort of mental side of things remains the same, right? It's at first could be terrifying, because if you've never experienced this type of harassment online, abuse online, you really don't know what's happening. You think that the whole world is against you. You think that everyone is coming after you. They're targeting you. They're targeting the people that you know. Your family members could be targeted. So it could be terrifying. And it was terrifying in my case when I first had the privilege, I guess, of going through this experience. It could also be extremely frustrating and annoying, because here you are, a journalist trying to report, trying to tell a story, trying to share something, some news, and yet, some keyboard warriors think that they have the right to come after you and to discredit everything that you're writing and sort of share this this information. They kind of mute your voice. They try to mute the story that you're telling with fake stories and facts, and they also try to discredit you as a journalist, as a professional journalist, right? So they create this sort of sense that what you're writing, what you're reporting on isn't really true, isn't really real. It could also be hazardous, because as a journalist, what makes me a journalist is my work, are my stories, what I tell, online or offline. But the impact that this type of abuse has on you as a journalist could really damage your profession, your career, because in a specific place where you're facing this type of harassment, whether it's usually in countries, right? Like I was targeted because of very specific story, or I was targeted because of a very specific type of work I was producing. In that country context, you as a journalist, your reputation can be on the line when you're being discredited in such a way. So it also has that kind of impact on you. It can also be intimidating. When I got my first death threat, I had no idea what I need to do. Like, what do you do when you get a death threat online on a Facebook Messenger, right? Of course, now I respond very differently. I kind of just documented, but at the beginning, when it was all happening for the first time, it was terrifying. You don't know whether this is something that you should really be worried about. You don't know if you need to go to the police. You don't even know if the police is going to take you seriously, because let's face it, not all law enforcement in all countries take online harassment and threats seriously when you go there for a complaint. So that was a very sort of interesting entry point for me to learn that, okay, if this is happening, if I'm getting threats, that I need to start documenting. Not because I was thinking that I'm going to ask for assistance from law enforcement, but just so that I have it as evidence in case I need to use it further down the line. And I think that was what helped me cope with the harassment that I was facing. Because again, as I said earlier, at the time when I first experienced it, I didn't know that what I was going through was online harassment. I didn't know that there were other journalists who were going through something very similar in different countries, in different contexts. I didn't know that there were actually organizations, individuals who were providing psychological help. They were providing professional help to deal with this. And I also didn't really have as much understanding of just how big and vast this problem was. And getting to know the environment within which there were so many different actors who were actually trying to help journalists who were in a similar position to myself also gave me an idea of coping by documenting and then by writing of what I experienced. And this is what I did pretty much 2 years after what happened to me. I wrote a story about trolls in Azerbaijan, and I put it in a larger context of what trolling really means in the context of disinformation and in the context of autocratic regimes like the one in Azerbaijan, sort of bringing it all together and describing how much that is becoming an issue in targeting not just women journalists, but journalists in general, because that was something that we were starting to observe as social media platforms were also becoming extremely popular in Azerbaijan and were being used by independent media platforms to cover news because they were either getting blocked or their journalists were getting intimidated. And so it was a very interesting transition. And now when I look back, it's been several years now, I feel like there's been a lot of progress made in addressing online harassment from the perspective of international organizations and various actors. There's been a lot of progress made from journalists' perspective, like myself. When I see it, I know what it is. I know how to act. I know how to not stress about it. And I think that's what also helps. The fact that that there is some kind of mechanism that's already in place, and that there's a conversation going around, not just with organizations, not just with journalists, but also on platform level. And so, it's been interesting to be among the wave of journalists to be experiencing online harassment. We all have very unique stories, and I've met so many women journalists, very courageous as well, doing extremely important work, who have faced similar forms of harassment and who actually have faced offline harassment because of the harassment that they faced online. Some really frightening stories, and I feel like my story is actually quite okay, because I didn't have anyone show up at my door. I didn't have anyone like physically come and threaten me, even though there were times when I felt that way or felt the anxiety of it. It's been quite a ride, I have to say, and I'm really grateful to actually be involved in the solution development part of things at this time, having being able to share my experience, but also being able to influence the narrative that goes around tackling online harassment, creating solutions for online harassment.
Arzu, thank you for this sincere account, and we will be talking more about how to deal with the problem. So I would like to ask you, Javier, we know that there are whole range of different tactics that are being used to harass people online, especially the journalists. And also there are different types that journalists encountering. There are individual attacks, there are state-sponsored campaigns, and there are, organized groups. So I know that IPI works and takes this issue seriously. So, what are the specific measures and methods newsrooms should consider taking in dealing with these attacks?
Well, first of all, yeah, thank you very much also for having me, and also thank you to Arzu to again laid out very crystal clear, you know, what are the impact on women journalists and on journalists, because she has described, you know, the impact on the emotional toll, but also the reputational toll and the professional toll, you know, on journalists. So she has really set up, you know, the basis, the foundations of these, of what we're talking about now. What you mentioned, it's and now to answer your question, well, there are two things here. With regard to the measures, we can talk a little bit later also on the second part about what newsrooms can do and should be doing. But before we tackle that, I think it's important to, as you were saying, disambiguate what is an attack by an individual, you know, that actually represents, you know, like someone venting or represents himself or herself or whatever gender you want to put there, to what is a coordinated attack, you know, because coordinated attacks have a very clear objective, which is impose the narrative, their narrative. They have an agenda behind. And a way to impose their narrative is to silence criticism. And they can do that in two different ways. One is through intimidation of the journalist to bring her to silence, you know, into silence, and the other one is discrediting their work through a smear campaigns, using disinformation tactics, as Arzu was explaining before. But for me, the really important part here of it, trying to impose a narrative, is that by discrediting the messenger, they discredit the message, but eventually the main goal, the main objective is the audience, their audience, to plant the seed of the doubt in the audience of critical reporters and critical, you know, news organizations. Why? First, because, you know, if you plant the seed of the audience on a specific article that this journalist has authored, you know, or that news outlet has published, if you plant the seed to one specific article, then this doubt will remain in their audience, you know, for longer terms for other pieces. That's one consequence. That's the first consequence. The second one, most importantly, is that most of the independent reporting now it's produced by smaller newsrooms, you know, that rely heavily, their survival relies heavily on the support of the community. So by planting the seed, you're weakening also their strength, their mere survival, but also the impact that the work that they work have on the very same community. Hence, you know, the war in trying to impose the narrative constantly. So I think that this is really important, you know, for our audience to understand that we're not only talking about what is considered a death threat and so on. It has a very impact and also a deep impact on the journalists, you know, but also they have to be aware that they are also being the object of this kind of war, even if it's indirect or secondary, but it's really important for them, because what Arzu was saying, you know, they are also part of this narrative about tackling online harassment. They also have to take a step forward, you know, whenever a journalist, you know, in the case of Arzu, but many other women journalists out there being heavily targeted, and you precisely know pretty much what I'm talking about as well, Ishin, in going to social media and showing solidarity and support to them. So, and also, you know, to tell them, look, listen, you know, we know that you are trying to, you know, to tell us what we should read and what we shouldn't, but we're not going to bend to your will, to your power, right? That's one. Second, and sorry if I'm extending a little bit, but when you talked about newsrooms, yes, I think that what we found in IPI, and we did that, we visited over, I don't know, like more than 40 newsrooms across Europe, interviewed over 100 journalists, but we've been working on online harassment, especially since already 2014, if I'm not mistaken. The fact is that we developed this protocol based in four steps that we'll talk about it on the second part. But my main point here is that the newsrooms, I think, that now are aware that this is an issue. Most of them are aware that this is an issue that can have an impact on the targets, on their journalists and their staff members. I don't know how much they are aware that this also have an impact on their economic sustainability, in the sense that if their audience, lose if the trust of their audience is eroded, that also has an economic impact on that. But also they do have a duty of care. My point being is that most of them, they know that this is an issue. I don't think that all of them know what to do specifically. They do provide support, especially to staff. I don't know that much to freelancers, but they do provide support ad hoc in a case-by-case study. And one of the things that we're trying to push from IPI is through training with different newsrooms and training with journalists is to try to set up protocols, to put systems in place that can be actioned and put in motion as soon as a report comes in or that the help is required to support a newsroom. Just basically because newsrooms, and that's why we focus on them ourselves, like IPI, International Press Institutes, because we are like newsrooms are kind of the firewall for the journalist.
Thank you very much. Especially, it is very important to understand the aim of these attacks, the attackers, and thank you very much to give a sense of what they're aiming at and the relation to the audience. And I would like to ask Professor Schriffin now my questions. She has done extensive work and research on countering this phenomenon. So from the legal aspect, Professor Schriffin, how can journalists individually tackle this problem?
Thank you very much. I think that the previous speakers have described very well some of the problems that journalists face. And one of them, of course, is that it takes a huge amount of time for women journalists or journalists to respond. And that really takes them away from their work, leads to all kinds of stress, as you point out. And ultimately, I think studies show that many women and women politicians actually stop doing what they were doing to begin with because the cost is so high in terms of personal stress and unhappiness. So I think that where possible, it's better to have more systemic solutions. An article I wrote a couple of years ago was interesting because it looked at journalists around the world who are bringing defamation lawsuits against their harassers. So this is quite common in South Africa now, also in Peru, and in several other jurisdictions. So people are bringing civil defamation lawsuits rather than criminal defamation lawsuits. And in some cases, this actually is effective and has silenced attackers. There's a few things to bear in mind. Obviously, it's expensive. The bar for proof can be quite high. In the US, there's First Amendment protection, so it's much less common to see these kind of lawsuits, although we saw some of them in the post-Trump era. I think Dominion Voting Machines was actually suing Donald Trump for defamation. I'm not sure if we'll talk about it now or later, but there are actually recommendations that have been made for what kinds of legal changes should be put into place. And I think, one point that sort of stymied some lawyers and academics is how you can have lawsuits that protect journalists but won't be used against journalists. So for example, online harassment, Jonathan McNulty, Scott Griffin, some of the experts have said, well, journalists ask multiple questions online, right? They repeatedly go after subjects. So you want to make sure that journalists are protected, but they're not accused themselves of doing harassment. So I'll stop there, but I can talk a little bit more on the next question about some other measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And before I go on the second round of questions, I would like to encourage our audience to submit questions if they have. They can use the Q&A function to write their questions, and we will try to answer them as well. So Arzu, could you also comment on the role of the online platforms regarding cyber harassment? For example, I know that they're also aware of the problem, and they have some features to moderate the harmful discussions and, and detecting the harmful content, but how effective are these?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think, well, there's, the fact that the social media platforms are part of the bigger conversation around what to do when a journalist is facing online harassment is already a quite big step, because I feel like if I remember correctly, back in 2014, 2015, when this discussion was just opening up to a wider audience, it wasn't so much mentioned. There weren't that many, we didn't see much of their presence in these conversations. So that's already a good sign, but having them involved in the conversation is not enough, clearly. So pretty much from the very beginning of the way social media platforms started playing a role in expanding the message, or maybe even making the harassment feel far worse than it already was, we realize, and by we, I mean journalists, but also international advocacy organizations and organizations that do provide assistance to journalists, that social media platforms need to actually take measures. And unfortunately, these measures have not been enough. Yes, we've seen a lot of commitment, we've seen a lot of promises, we've seen some tools thrown here and there, some response mechanisms, but at the end of the day, there is still a lack of context in certain countries when it comes to social media platforms. There is still a lack of language when it comes to certain countries where these social media platforms operate, and still lack of overall awareness of how severe situations may be. And, I will give you an example from Azerbaijan, because this is one of the examples I'm familiar with the most. When we had a massive case of harassment that was targeting anti-war activists in 2020 during the war that took place between Armenia and Azerbaijan, when we made requests to Facebook, for instance, to take down some of the pages or specific posts that were being posted on these pages, we received a response saying that these were not in violation of the community guidelines. And clearly, they responded this way because they completely missed the point. Because in a political context, as sensitive as we saw in 2020, this was a violation, this was a harassment, and hence it had to be taken down, but it wasn't. So we're seeing a perfect example of lack of an understanding. Within the same example, we can say the same about the language. We, as native speakers of languages, obviously know and can differentiate between what can constitute as a violation of community guidelines and what doesn't, whereas platforms don't. And one of the reasons for that is the decision-making process within the platforms is based on an algorithm, right? It's not an actual physical person sitting and sifting through. Well, yes, clearly there are physical people who are doing content moderation, but they're also, it's an algorithm, it's artificial intelligence. And it doesn't get it. It doesn't get it because it has not been fed enough contextual and language-based information to differentiate and then to actually respond when you make a request for a takedown or when you report a tweet, for instance. And so one of the asks for a while with the social media platforms that do content moderation has been to open up the algorithm. So that the civil society, the journalists all over the world can actually feed that algorithm with all the different languages that constitute harassment and constitute death threat, that constitute abuse. But we haven't seen that. We haven't seen it. We're still probably wishfully hoping that at some point this will be made available. But until then, it becomes a struggle because on one hand, you are facing abuse. It's emotionally exhausting. It's time consuming to battle with it because you're one person against a group because as Javier rightfully pointed, it could be coordinated, it could be individual. And when you're stuck in that wave of harassment, you can't even differentiate, what's what. So in that particular situation, you then also lack response from platforms. So imagine when you're being harassed, you write a report, and that's also mind-boggling that you actually have to write a report, that there's no direct button, or a way to reach out to these platforms to tell them that, listen, I'm being, attacked from all these different platforms. Please take measures. What has been really useful, obviously, is to have organizations that work with social media platforms, sort of like acting as intermediaries. I've seen how they can be very effective in tackling this, and huge appreciation goes to these organizations and to the digital security teams at these organizations, because they basically have been the solutions for people who have been facing all kinds of harassment online, whether it's trolling, whether it's account shutdowns, but specifically harassment as well. And also what has been very useful is to keep talking about these issues and keep documenting, because the more examples we have of how and when social media platforms fail to respond, the more evidence we have in conversations with platforms advocating for better measures, for better tools for journalists, for wider civil society community, because this is not obviously specific just to journalists as we're seeing. And so, yeah, I think with companies and social media platforms, we've made some progress, but it's not enough, and we're missing so many crucial moments when far more measures could be taken, far more can be done, but we can't because our hands are tied, because all of this platform content moderation mismanagement, let me put it that way.
Can I come in here, please?
Sure.
Can I come in?
Please.
Great. Yeah,
Sure.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this point about opening algorithms and the responsibility of the platforms. I'm really tired of people asking platforms to do things that will create more work for them. It is the responsibility of the platforms to have content moderation in all languages. We know at this point that AI solutions are not enough, and you need human moderators. They open up their algorithms, no problem. It's going to create more work for civil society. Actually, content moderation and stopping trolling is part of their business. It's like Walmart in the old days not paying health insurance. Their workers had to get health insurance from the US government. That meant public money was subsidizing a private company. You're being harassed. Why is it your job to document, to convince, to analyze the algorithm? It is the job of Facebook and Twitter. They're making money hand over fist, hiring enough moderators, especially in foreign languages, is their job. It is part of their cost of doing business. And if they can't do that as part of their cost of doing business, then they shouldn't be in business. You know, a lot of these guys, Zuckerberg, they're all libertarians. They believe the private sector is so fantastic. They don't want government involvement. Well, then do your job. Don't waste my time. You know, Andrew Guess of Princeton talks about the opportunity cost for academics. Joan Donovan talks about at Harvard how we're all cleaning up their mess. They created this mess. Let them spend some money to fix it and let them do that in a transparent way. It's absurd. You know, so I totally agree with you, Arzu, but you know what? It's not our job to go around analyzing their algorithms for them. They know what's in their, I mean, they don't always know what's in their algorithms, right? But they can spend money and get more moderators, pay them decently. So we don't have this sort of sweatshop, you know, moderation system that we have now. And of course, while I'm at it, they should be taxed much more, right? So, you know, I just resent the last 5 to 10 years. We're all spending all this time on like, well, how can we make them behave better? Fines, regulation, and spending some money. So I did want to just put that out there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well said, Professor Schriffin. Thank you. And to understress how these algorithms can go awry, I can give you a recent example after this Russian invasion to Ukraine. You know, so many of my colleagues who are unrelated to Russia are affiliated to Russian official, you know, media. They had this banner in Twitter. So they're trying to get rid of those, and it's very difficult to tell them because it's the algorithm that catch them up for what we don't know. And you know, so you're right. And so Javier, you mentioned that you have been visiting lots of countries for trainings in newsrooms, and so could I ask you, you know, how do newsrooms in different countries deal with the problem, because it might differ from country to country. And also, could you a little bit mention maybe all of it, the new protocol to us?
Yep. So the main difference between country to countries is well, there are two things: the context that we were talking right now, receiving a death threat or a series of verbal abuse or doxing, you know, messages on Twitter or on Facebook in Mexico. It's not the same that receiving in Finland. It's not the same in the sense that for the journalist, because the perceived danger of the journalist would differ a lot, and the emotional impact would be completely different as well, right? And the professional impact as well. With regard to specifically newsrooms, I think that they're like the main thing for newsrooms, you know, but also talking more broadly about what Arzu and Professor Schriffin was saying about the role and responsibility of social media platforms, the role and responsibility also of the community and of the newsrooms, is that to let everyone understand that this is not okay. Because what we find with many journalists is the fact that they think that this is already part of the job. And what it's concerning, it's not, you know, well-established, you know, journalists, but also youngsters who are starting now, that they think that this is what comes with the job. So the first thing that newsrooms have to do is to create a conducive environment within the newsroom where actually journalists feel encouraged to come forward and report. Because we're still, even if there are many women journalists, you know, in newsrooms, there's still a dominant macho culture, especially in journalism, that, you know, well, you know, you've received, I don't know how many threats or verbal abuse online. Well, when I was in the war, when I was covering this, you know, this is nothing to do with that. Well, no, in fact, the reality is that having a window where in your pocket through which everyone can actually throw at you any kind of message threat, rape threat, memes, putting your head within a target around, these can have, and we've seen these proven over and over again by psychologists and psychiatrists. Like, for example, there's lots of them working at the Dart Center for Journalism Trauma, saying that the impact and the potential symptoms of a PTSD symptomatology, can be very, very much present in journalists working within newsrooms themselves. So the first and the whole goal of the IPI protocol is to create this conducive environment, and it can be through very formal, mechanisms, but also informal mechanisms. Informal mechanisms such as in their editorial meetings, in their daily editorial meetings, just openly have the editor talking about the issue, even preventing about it, like meaning we know that we're going, for example, in the US in the upcoming months, there will be the midterms over there. So like the editors should be openly and very informally, talking in the editorial newsrooms, in the editorial meetings. Hey, just, bear in mind that probably most of you will be targeted and so on, targeted with online reviews and online harassment. Please just be aware that this is a protocol, or just come and talk to me, or just go and talk to the online safety, or talk to a colleague, but just be aware that these will be present. So normalizing, the conversation about this topic, it's really, really important. That's first. Then there is a second part that requires a little bit of training, but also requires a little bit, let's put it, of art and intuitive guess, which is the risk assessment. And the risk assessment needs to be produced at three different levels: the emotional risk, the professional risks, how likely is this women journalist, to self-censor herself, how likely she is to do that to herself. And the third very important one is the reputational risk. And the reputational risk, it's really important that both, her colleagues, but also in certain cases, the news organizations themselves, to put out a public statement in support of the work of her journalist, their journalists. We have a couple of examples recently. The New York Times and the Washington Post have published, statements of support. Very much recently, the Washington Post published a full-page advertising supporting their columnist Rana Ayub, an Indian, very prominent Indian women journalist that has been heavily targeted by populist government and the extreme ruling party in India right now. So there's the second step, this risk assessment, and the risk assessment has to be done together with the journalist, right? Then there is the third step, which is the support itself. So you can have, but of course that really depends on the assessment, right? So you have support from, of course, legal support, psychological support, but also more like simple ways of supporting, their journalists, just basically asking them or asking her to take a couple of days of distance, from the harassment, right? Just a couple of days to lay low, take it, but just allow them to take the decision for themselves as well, to do that, provide that environment where they also will feel that it's okay to take these 2 days, 1 day, whatever, a couple of hours, away from the newsroom, away from the current affairs. And they will not be a lesser journalist just to be doing that. And this is essential, for everyone to understand, starting from the editorial and management positions upwards and downwards as well. Then also very important in terms of support mechanisms and responses. And this third step, which is what actually, and I know that because I know Arzu and Arzu's case, because I had the privilege to interview her for a film documentary that we did for the OSCE in their safety of female journalists online. There's a software project called A Dark Place. It was in partnership with the International Press Institute, and actually the title A Dark Place, it's based on a response from Arzu herself. But going back to what I wanted to say is that one of the things that she's done, she also said it at the beginning of the session, is to use these attacks as an object of study. So it really empowers the journalist that has been targeted to put their journalistic skills into practice, to basically try to understand, who is behind this attack, what's the purpose, what's the message that they want to implement, and to embed in their audience. And third, understand that this is not a personal attack, but an attack against their persona. So in that sense, you will also be able as a human being to get distance, from the attack themselves and take control over it by putting what what to do, into practice. And the last step, which not for being the last is the least important, is the reassessment of the whole cycle. So, okay, so we know that this person has been, attacked, especially these women journalists. We're talking about women journalists, but we also had to add layers of a race, of religion, of also other gender, perspectives there as well, right? So we have done this risk assessment, based on 3 different levels. We have implemented certain support mechanisms, and now we need to understand whether all this has been efficient or not, And very important also aspect in the reassessment is the document and tracking of the cases. Because by doing that, you will know first the efficiency, not only of the support mechanisms towards the journalist, but also, whether the whole infrastructure, the whole system, it's actually can be improved, it's working or not. But also, because if different newsrooms do that, they will be able to identify who more easily, who are behind these attacks. Because I'm sure that, those attacking, through their on-site comment sections or on their social media channels, they are also connected, those attacking specific newsrooms. I'm sure that there's also connected to those attacking journalists in newsrooms similar to in editorial line and position wise to the first one, right? So this is what we're doing. I've been, like yesterday precisely, I was doing a training session with journalists from working for minority language news organizations, and then on Friday as well, last Friday, and then we're doing a series of trainings as well with newsrooms across Europe, and yeah, so happy to also know that there are many newsrooms, as I said at the beginning, that they know that this is an issue, that they don't know, what to do, but that they reach out to experts like Arzu, like also in the US, PEN America is doing an amazing job as well. So the big points to them as well. In Europe, there are many other organizations as well besides IPI working on this issue. So I think that's important to put it out there.
Thank you so much, Javier. And I will leave the floor to Professor Schriffin to tell us a little bit more about how to tackle legally. But there is also an audience question. Maybe I can put it to you. It's regarding, I suppose, this using the defamation cases against the trollers. Our audience, Christian Feyland, put the question: what would be the red line of wording be for a court case, the red line from a heated and upset audience to harassment? And is there a difference legally seen if the person is female or male? Just put it for you.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I would say that this would depend a lot on the different countries' legal standards. So I think it depends. Some places have restrictions on violent speech, incitement to violence, hate crimes, racist, illegal speech. So it really, really varies. For example, as you know, in Germany, there's something like 17 categories of illegal speech, including, swastikas, whereas in the US, we've had a huge increase in Asian American hate crimes and hate speech. And it's been very, very difficult in New York, for example, to actually document that and punish people for it. So I think it depends a lot on the sort of free speech laws of each country. What the OESC has recommended is low burden. I'm just looking at something I wrote about this, sort of laws that will be a low burden for journalists. And they've got a whole they published a great report, I think in 2018, 2019, about what kinds of laws are effective and can work. And Finland and France now have those laws. So they have laws that specifically target cyber harassment of journalists, or digital violence, as Karen Attia would prefer to call it. The French law protects people from doxing, and not just journalists, doxing, defamation, insult, and harassment, both online and offline. And when this law was passed, the Reporters Without Borders was very clear that enforcement really needed to be stepped up, and also that the police needed to be equipped. So as always, it's not just a question of passing good laws, it's making sure that the courts are able to, handle those kinds of cases, and that the police is able as well to arrest, to make and make prosecutions. So I would say the standards really vary across countries, but I think part of what I find frustrating is that we have great guidance now on what laws could look like, and we have examples of countries that have those laws. So I think it's really important to put them in place. I definitely, in the US under Trump, we had so many debates because everyone said, well, if we pass any laws, they can be misused. But I think the lesson is that when you have an autocrat in power, anything can be misused. So I think that countries that have vibrant democracies need to act. And we can't just, if Europe is in good shape or Germany is in a good position, it's a functioning democracy. I don't think you can say that Germany or France or the UK shouldn't regulate, because it may get misused in Singapore or in China or in Russia. I think countries that can regulate should regulate. Yes, sometimes these laws, these hate speech laws or fake news laws, do get sort of misused in other places, but those are countries that have a tradition of cracking down on freedom of the press. I lived in Vietnam for a couple of years as a journalist, and I always say, China and Vietnam didn't really need lessons from Germany in how to crack down on the media. They're doing it very effectively on their own. So I think where we can regulate, we absolutely should regulate. I'm going to have to go to class in a minute, but I will listen as long as I can. But this was a really interesting panel, so thank you.
Professor Schriffin, thank you very much. It was all illuminating, and I think we have a few more minutes to discuss, maybe for your last thoughts. But I have a question to ask, is that I'll put it openly. Arzu and Javier, maybe you can tell more about it. In countries like ours, where we have leaders who are attacking the media, journalists, openly shouting at crowds, we have these examples. And most recently, we have seen Russia's leader using gendered language to tell a position regarding Ukraine. So what can you suggest how to report and how to protect yourself? Maybe you have some quick thoughts about that. Arzu, would you like to start first?
Sure. There are obviously the basics, right? You have to know your digital security, the A, B, and C, to know how to protect your accounts, to have friends who know how to deal with situations when you're being harassed or you're being trolled or you're being intimidated. But none of these measures prevent or can really remove online harassment, especially in challenging political environments within which we live and operate. So what can you do? The easy and the honest answer is not much. You just know what you can face, be as prepared as one could be, knowing being in touch with multiple contacts and having some solutions and measures in place, either as a freelance journalist or as a newsroom. And this also extends to editors as well, or to even fixers and translators who are working in challenging political environments. And just go on with it. I mean, obviously, the most controversial other answer that I could give you is to move to like decentralized internet, like completely go off these platforms and create an alternative reality, basically, or like join these conversations there. But clearly, that's not on the books yet. I mean, there are discussions, but not as common. So yeah, I mean that like clearly you need to be prepared. You need to know what to do. You need to protect your accounts, but you also need to know that no matter what you do, you may have deal with keyboard warriors who are going to come after you, or people that you know, and just be stoic. Like, don't let any of that get to you, because once you do, you really are in a dark place. So the most important thing is that like, you know, threshold between letting it get to you and not. So that's my advice.
Thank you. And what would you like to add, Javier?
Yeah, just basically adding on what Arzu was saying. I think that it's important two things with regard from a journalist, right? To do one, and one is first of all, and I think that all of us we should do that, including myself, is to try to do this exercise that it's called self-doxing. So try to go through your digital footprint and try to identify what are the potential vulnerabilities that they're going to take over. And again, you know, if someone wants to go and target you, they will use whatever glimpse they would put, scrub, you know, like crop a picture, put it under false light and do whatever, but at least try to make this exercise for them very blatantly clear that this is a doctor picture. So try to go through your digital footprint and analyze what are the vulnerabilities. That's one. And the second very important part is try to join these peer support networks groups like this. These are usually very active within the countries, within community of journalists that they know each other very well, and to support each other, you know, using counter speech. So it can be like secret Facebook groups, private Facebook groups among women journalists in, just guessing, Finland or in Turkey or whatever, you know, that you can coordinate certain responses and show solidarity online. That's really important. And if I know that we're running out of time, but just basically on a very, very short note, on the regulation aspect and so on, and talking about vibrant democracies and so on. If there's something that we've learned is that vibrant democracies can very quickly and suddenly erode and fade away into autocratic or government with a tendencies to autocracies, let's put it this way, or far right. Like I'm thinking even about my own country, Spain, you know, like we would never imagine that not even 50 years had passed, or barely 50 years had passed from our dictator dying, that now there's a huge movement now, political movement with a big presence, you know, in the parliament of Spain, that they are not condoning the war crimes, you know, and the crimes done by Franco dictatorship. So I'm just putting that as an example. And also we've seen the misuse of slabs right now in Europe. It's one of the big issues, you know. So when we talk about being careful, you know, about regulations and so on, is mainly not regulating, but being very careful about the wording of it, you know, and setting up certain limits and firewalls to protect, free speech, because when it's widely said that the first victim of a war or conflict, it's the truth, right? Or at least the truth that it's considered. So on that note, what I would really stress and put the accent into regulations, it's more in what both Arzu and Professor Schriffin said, also doctor, sorry, is in the capacitation of the authorities, but also in providing them with enough resources, both economic and human resources, to actually implement whatever needs to be regulated or what it's already regulated out there. I think that this part of enabling the people who can do something, authorities and institutions who can do something, and they're willing to do something to actually do it,
With these words, I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Professor Anya Schriffin, Arzu Geybulla, and Javier Martinez, thank you very much. It was very important what you tell, and we have to think about it more. And thank you very much for being our audience. Your solidarity will help us more to do our job, journalism. Thank you and goodbye.